Hello and welcome to this overview of the Ross-Garrett model for moral decision making. I'm James Sennett. I'm Professor of Business Ethics in the School of Business at Brunel University. Please be sure to read the website A Simple and Usable Ethical Theory before reviewing this video. You should find it attached to the same email that gave you a link to this video. It's a very short but very important introduction to the moral theory of W.D. Ross, a 20th century British philosopher on whose work this model for moral decision-making is based. The article is written by philosopher Garrett, who makes some interesting and important revisions and additions to the theory as well. Garrett's contributions also inform my model, hence the moniker, the Ross-Garrett Model for moral decision-making. Some have suggested I might want to call this the Ross-Garrett Model, and if I ever get it published, I probably will use that or something similar, but in the meantime I'm doing my best to keep my all too volatile sense of self-importance in check. Ross, like Immanuel Kant and other moral theorists, believed that the key notion in morality is duty. Hence, Ross is what philosophical ethicists call a deontologist. However, Ross differs from Kant in at least two very important ways. First, Kant believed that all morality boils down to a single duty, what he called the categorical imperative. The most famous version of this imperative, Kant gave several, is quote, act only from those maxims, that is, rules, that you could rationally will should become a universal law. In other words, if it's not okay for everybody to do it, it's not okay for you to do it. Ross does not think that all morality can be boiled down to a single duty. Instead, he gives us a list of several moral duties and leaves the door open for others to be added. Second, Kant believed that moral decision-making is a matter of logic. So, for example, the concept of rationally willing that was invoked in the categorical imperative demonstrates that immorality is actually a matter of practical irrationality. Kant argued that the logic of morality can be codified and applied with every bit as much precision as the rules of formal logic or mathematics. Moral reasoning is a matter of deductive derivation, according to Kant. Ross does not think that moral duties are grounded in logic, but rather in what he called moral intuition. However, it's important not to misunderstand this word. Ross does not mean by intuition simply whatever pops into our heads or whatever we feel or desire. Rather, Ross means by moral intuition a moral idea that is so clear and obvious to us that we actually consider it impossible that we could be wrong. Take, for example, the simple moral claim, it's wrong to take something that does not belong to you without permission, or more succinctly, it's wrong to steal. Ross argues that this simple claim is obviously true. So obvious, in fact, that virtually no one would argue with us about it. If someone did argue with us, we would think that she was being facetious or obnoxious or just trying to kid with us. If we became convinced that she was serious, we would think the person was mentally or emotionally disturbed in some way. The one thing we would never consider is that the claim, it's wrong to steal, is controversial in any way. It's as obvious to us that it is wrong to steal as it is that the average human being has 2 arms and 2 legs. Ross argues that this level of intuitive clarity is all that's required to justify our beliefs in moral claims like it's wrong to steal. If we are rational in believing that people have 2 arms and 2 legs, we are rational in believing that it's wrong to steal. Ross identifies 7 such intuitively obvious moral duties. These are explained in the Garrett article, but they're so foundational and important to the Ross-Garrett model that I'm going to take time to review them here as well. So here are Ross's 7 duties. First, fidelity. Speak and behave honestly and properly represent yourself to the world. This duty obviously includes telling the truth and not lying. It also includes keeping promises and not acting in deceitful ways. Reparation. Make up for any loss, damage, or harm you've caused. Gratitude. Be grateful for good done for you and repay it by doing good for others. Justice. Distribute the benefits and burdens of community fairly. Beneficence. Do good. Act to benefit others. Harm prevention. Do not allow harm to come to anyone. Self-improvement. Practice beneficence and harm prevention toward yourself. Take care of yourself and work to better yourself. Now you may have noticed that Garrett actually identifies 8 duties from Ross. This is because he splits Ross's 6th duty into 2. What he calls non-malfeasance, or doing no harm, and then harm prevention, which he defines as acting to prevent harm. These really are 2 different concepts. They both have to do with not hurting anyone, but non-malfeasance is passive. Don't do anything to cause harm. While harm prevention is active. Do what you can to prevent harm from occurring. Now, even though Garrett is technically correct in dividing this duty into 2, I preserve Ross's original list for a variety of reasons I won't go into here. The duty is harm prevention, which we define as don't allow harm to come to anyone. This is stated in such a way that it includes both the active and passive senses of the duty. Also, you notice that Garrett adds 3 duties to Ross's list, all 3 of which Garrett believes, and I agree, that Ross would sanction. The first duty that Garrett adds is respect for rights. We should respect and protect the rights of others. Now, Garrett actually uses the terminology respect for freedom, but freedom can best be spelled out, I think, in terms of the ability to exercise our rights. So for this and other reasons, I prefer to think of this duty as the duty to respect the rights of others. Garrett also lists special care. Show the special care that's due to those with whom we have close relationships, family, friend, etc. Again, I've changed Garrett's label. He refers to this duty simply as care, and this is too easily misunderstood. My students often think of it as simply we should take care of each other or we should care about each other. But this obligation is covered in many of the other duties already discussed. The duty of special care, rather, recognizes that we do not have the same obligations to everyone. Some people, because of their special relationship to us, have the right to expect special attention from us. They deserve a larger measure of our energy and commitment. We owe more to our families, close friends, and others in special relationship to us than we do to people in general. This duty is a recognition of this virtuous imbalance of moral obligation. Finally, Garrett adds non-parasitism. Do not be a leech on society or your family. Pull your own weight. Do what you can to contribute. Well, this duty pretty much explains itself. Each member of a community who benefits from that community has a moral obligation to contribute to the community so others may benefit as well. That's how community works, whether it's a family, a neighborhood, or a nation. So now we have 10 duties, Ross's 7 and Garrett's 3 additions. But we're not done yet. There are 3 more additions that I make to the model, grounded in standard moral theory and, I believe, a good dose of Ross's moral intuition. The first duty I add is utility maximizing. Act to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Next, universalizability. Act in ways that you would want others to act in the same situations. And finally, the golden rule. Treat others the way you believe you ought to be treated. Now, the first of these, maximizing utility, is taken from the moral theory of utilitarianism, perhaps the most popular moral theory in the Western world today. Now, utilitarians hold that maximizing utility is the only fundamental moral duty and that all other moral duties are duties because, at least in the long run, they do not lead to and maybe even work directly against maximizing utility. Now, of course, this claim is controversial, but there can be no doubt that bringing about the greatest good for the greatest number is a critically important moral consideration and belongs on our list of fundamental moral duties. Universalizability is an ugly word, but it's a very helpful and useful moral concept. It derives immediately from Kant's categorical imperative. A few minutes ago, we stated the imperative as act only on those maxims or rules that you could rationally will should become a universal law. In other words, we should do something only if it's rational to say everybody should act this way. That is, if it wouldn't be okay for everybody to do it, then we shouldn't. This rule is grounded in the idea that morality is no respecter of persons. What is moral for one person is moral for all. So I often sum up the categorical imperative for my students by saying, if it's not okay for everyone to do it, then it's not okay for you to do it because you are nobody special. The third duty, the golden rule, is one that most of us have heard since we were kids. It's a staple of virtually every major religious tradition in the world, and has always been recognized as a good shortcut rule for figuring out the right thing to do. So we have a total of 13 duties. These 13 will serve as the foundation of our Ross-Garrett model for moral decision making. Now, when I was a kid, we used to refer to any collection of 13 things as a baker's dozen. This stemmed from the old tradition of your friendly neighborhood baker putting together a dozen donuts or rolls or buns for you, and then throwing in an extra one as a thank you for being a good customer. Well, I'm going to show my age and refer to this collection of 13 duties as the baker's dozen. As you'll see, I need a convenient nickname for referring to this group of duties, so this is the one I will adopt. Anytime I say the baker's dozen, I'm referring to these 13 duties. Now, it's very important to bear in mind that Ross does not consider his list of duties to be closed. That is, he thought his list was probably incomplete and could stand to be expanded. And as we'll see, this is precisely what the Ross-Garrett model is designed to do. But for many reasons, it'll be important to refer back to the original set, hence the name the baker's dozen. Ross calls these basic moral duties prima facie duties. Prima facie, of course, is a Latin term that literally translates first face or initial view. Perhaps the most accurate translation in most of its applications is something like at first glance. Now, with regards to these fundamental duties, I believe that the best way to interpret the prima facie label is that they are duties that apply all things being equal. One good way to think about the implications of the label prima facie is to say that these duties are to be followed in any given situation unless we have very good reason to believe they should not be followed in a given situation. Now, it's not necessary to argue that the prima facie duties do apply or should be followed in certain circumstances, but it is necessary to argue that they should not be followed in given circumstances. In other words, the one who claims that a duty does not apply bears the burden of proof. It's up to her to provide reasons for her claim. It's not up to the one advocating that a prima facie duty should be followed to provide reasons. Moral intuition supplies all the justification that's needed. But what could possibly count as a good reason to believe that a prima facie duty should not be followed in a given circumstance? Well, the most common reason why a given prima facie duty should not be followed in given circumstances is that it conflicts with another prima facie duty that also applies in those circumstances. So, for example, there's the age-old conundrum, is it wrong to lie in order to save someone's life? Here we have the duties of fidelity and harm prevention in conflict. Fidelity says we should tell the truth. Harm prevention says we should do what we can to prevent harm. If we obey fidelity, we violate harm prevention, and vice versa. Such dilemmas show that it's not possible to follow all of these duties every time they are applicable. When duties conflict like this, we cannot follow one without violating the other. So what are we to do? Well, one solution Ross says we do not have. There is no hierarchy of duties, showing us which are more important than which. In other words, the baker's dozen cannot be simply ranked 1 to 13 in importance so that we can just check the list and see which duty is higher. For any two prima facie duties, it's possible for the first to be more important than the second in some circumstances, and the second to be more important than the first in other circumstances. So, how do we tell which is which? How can we resolve the dilemma of conflicting prima facie duties? Well, this requires a process that Ross calls deliberation. We must consider a number of relevant issues in order to figure out how to weigh the conflicting duties against each other. Eventually, Ross believes, our deliberation will bring us to a conclusion that one of the conflicting duties is the overriding duty that must be followed in this situation. This overriding duty Ross calls our actual duty. Now, in developing this model, I have compiled a list of what I call deliberative conditions. These are the particular kinds of issues that tend to be relevant when prima facie duties conflict. A good way to think of these conditions is in terms of the answers to the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, or why. So, for example, answers to the who question would tell us the status and the relationships of the people most prominently involved in or affected by the decision to be made. Also, answers to the what question would tell us the facts of the situation that are directly relevant to the decision to be made. Now, one very important revision that Garrett makes to Ross's theory is the addition of what he calls priority rules. These are rules of thumb to help us in judging certain common prima facie duty conflicts. Garrett cites 3 such rules: the priority of non-malfeasance, all things being equal, harm prevention overrides other conflicting duties; the priority of fidelity, all things being equal, fidelity takes priority over beneficence; and finally, the priority of long-term benefit over short-term pleasure or pain. All things being equal, long-term benefits override any short-term pain or pleasure that may result from alternative actions. Now, it's important to understand that priority rules, just like the duties themselves, are prima facie. They themselves may be overwritten in certain circumstances. Hence my use of the phrase all things being equal to open my description of each of these rules. However, the moral intuition behind the priority rules means that they are to be followed unless there's very good reason to believe that they should not be followed in given circumstances. Any applicable priority rule should be considered as the first step in the deliberation phase of the Ross-Garrett model. So, here's the basic outline of the Ross-Garrett model: prima facie duties, deliberation, actual duties. We should first identify the prima facie duties that apply to the situation under consideration. We should then deliberate over any conflicts that arise among those duties, utilizing applicable deliberative conditions and priority rules. And finally, from that deliberation, we should determine what our actual duty is in this situation. Now, of course, the second and third steps of the model only kick in when 2 or more prima facie duties conflict. If there are no conflicting duties, then the applicable prima facie duty or duties determine our actual duty with no additional deliberation. But the real work of moral decision-making comes in when the prima facie duties do conflict. In other words, the critical phase of the model is the deliberation phase, including the consideration of any applicable priority rules. Now, it's important at this point to note that in the spirit of Ross's original theory, this entire structure is open-ended. As we've seen, the prima facie duties is not a closed list. There's room for moral intuition to suggest other prima facie duties that should be added. Likewise, neither the list of priority rules nor the list of other deliberative conditions is a closed list. There is room for clear moral intuition to suggest additions to each. In particular, additions should be made to all of these lists when considering the moral guidelines that are appropriate for a given specialized field of activity or responsibility. And this brings us to the main point of this video, the application of the Ross-Garrett model to professional ethics. I developed the Ross-Garrett model as a decision-making procedure for my business ethics students. Consequently, I sought ways to develop and specialize the model for the particular kinds of decisions that people typically face in the business world. To this end, I developed a list of what I call prima facie, business-specific prima facie duties. For example, profitability. Conduct business in such a way as to maximize shareholder wealth in the long run. Due care. Take every precaution to ensure the safety of consumers who use products and services and protect them from all foreseeable danger. Persuasion without manipulation. Employ only those marketing strategies and tactics that will not manipulate consumers or bypass informed consent in purchasing. I have 16 such prima facie business-specific prima facie duties, which I introduce to students as the class progresses and as we cover the specific types of business ethics issues to which they most readily apply. For example, I introduce persuasion without manipulation in the unit on ethics in marketing. Now, the prima facie duty of profitability is an especially interesting one for the study of business ethics. Many people would balk at the idea of profitability being a moral duty. However, businesses typically take money from investors on the understanding, that is, with the promise, that the businesses will use that money in the most effective way possible to maximize the wealth of the investors. Hence, profitability becomes a matter of promise-keeping, a species of the prima facie duty to fidelity from the baker's dozen. But this duty is only properly understood when we remember one of the cardinal rules of the Ross-Garrett model. There is no hierarchy of prima facie duties. Any given duty can override or be overridden by any other duty in different circumstances. The upshot for profitability is this: yes, profitability is a prima facie moral duty, but it may be overridden by other duties. Of course, it may also override other duties in certain circumstances. Like any other prima facie duty, profitability does not always win, but it does not always lose either. The moral duty of profitability is so central to the whole concept of business ethics that I define a business ethics problem specifically as a conflict between the prima facie duty of profitability and some other prima facie duty or set of prima facie duties. In other words, all business ethics problems can be analyzed in terms of a conflict between profitability and some other prima facie duty the business has. This analytical viewpoint is what I call in my classes the business ethics perspective. It plays a large role in the development of the class. But again, duties are not the only prima facie element of the Ross-Garrett model. As the class goes on, we also compile a list of business-specific priority rules and a list of business-specific deliberative conditions. So, for example, business-specific priority rules include the priority of employee vulnerability. All things being equal, protection of the vulnerability of employees to the abuse of employer power takes precedence over the protection of the vulnerability of employers to the abuse of employee power. Yes, employees have power. Come take my class and I'll tell you how. There's also the priority of job qualification and performance. All things being equal, an employee's qualifications for and performance at the position she holds take precedence in evaluation over any other issues pertaining to decisions regarding workplace access. In other words, regarding hiring, assessment, promotion, dismissal. Business-specific deliberative conditions include the condition of stakeholder identification. Stakeholders with interests at stake in a decision should be identified as clearly as possible. There's also the condition of stakeholder interest identification. The interests of the stakeholders that are at stake in a decision should be identified as clearly as possible. These are two sides of the same coin, but two important issues. And then there's also the business interests and employee interests consideration. Often the interests of a business conflict with the interests of its employees in business decision making. So these interests on each side must be carefully identified and weighed against one another to determine which takes priority in each given situation. Issues of employee privacy often involve this consideration. So in the first couple of weeks of my business ethics class, I do the following. First, I introduce my students to Ross's basic moral theory. I usually do this by using the Garrett article I asked you to read. I then summarize Ross's theory systematize Ross's theory into the Ross-Garrett model, complete with the baker's dozen, priority rules, and deliberative conditions. Finally, I introduce the concepts of business-specific prima facie duties, business-specific priority rules, and business-specific deliberation conditions, together with the first one or two entries into each of these lists. We then spend the rest of the class adding business-specific entries to each of these lists as our discussion of business ethics problems in various areas give rise to them. All the case analyses and many of the discussion questions and the quiz and exam questions require students to analyze and decide business ethics dilemmas by walking explicitly through the steps of the Ross-Garrett model. They identify conflicting prima facie duties, they identify any applicable priority rules, they deliberate over the conflict, employing any applicable deliberative conditions, and finally they determine and argue for a given prima facie duty as the overriding and actual duty to be followed. This gives a great unity and continuity to the course's content and its assessment instruments, and also gives the students lots of practice in applying the model. So at long last, my horribly misnamed overview is complete. Now it's time for you to think about whether or not, and in what ways, you might see the Ross-Garrett model as applicable and adaptable to your profession as a method for moral decision making. To that end, here's a series of questions I'd like for you to think through and compose some answers that are as specific and detailed as possible in preparation for our panel discussion. First, what is your overall impression of the Ross-Garrett model as a potential tool for professional ethics in your particular field? Can you identify, at least to a first approximation, one or two, or 8 or 10, discipline-specific prima facie rules for professionals in your field? Can you identify, at least to a first approximation, any discipline-specific priority rules for professionals in your field? Can you identify, at least to a first approximation, any discipline-specific deliberative conditions for professionals in your field? Are there ways in which you believe the general structure of the Ross-Garrett model would need to be revised or adapted in order to serve as a method for moral decision making in your field? And finally, overall, and with any suggested revisions implemented, would you see the introduction of a discipline-specific version of the Ross-Garrett model to be a step forward in the effort to create a helpful method for moral decision making in your profession? And please give reasons for your judgment. Well, thank you for enduring this tutorial and for your willingness to participate in the panel discussion. Please contact me with any questions, observations, or suggestions you have. I'll be in touch. and I'll see you on April 10th.